Yeah, my name is Bill Carrigan. I'm professor of history here at Rowan. I've been at Rowan since 1999. I got my PhD from Emory University in Atlanta, and I got my undergraduate from University of Texas at Austin. I specialize in U.S. history. Here at Rowan, I teach United States history surveys, and I also teach upper-level courses on things like the Civil War and Reconstruction, history of New Jersey, history of the American West. Right, so the history of Thanksgiving is an interesting one, and it is one that is kind of, not well known by the average American. A lot of people associate it with the first Thanksgiving in Massachusetts, but in reality, the celebration of Thanksgiving as the last Thursday in November, that began during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln called for a day of Thanksgiving to kind of honor the sacrifices of those people who had lost family members during the Civil War, and to ask God for aid, as Lincoln said, however his divine purpose wills it, as the war continued. And since it was not celebrated every year prior to 1863, occasionally presidents would call for days of Thanksgiving. For example, in George Washington's 8 years as president, he called for 2 days of Thanksgiving. One was in October and one was in February. John Adams followed up by calling for 2 during his 4 years. Thomas Jefferson, a deist, never called for a day of Thanksgiving. So it was not an unknown thing. And of course, states had their own days of Thanksgiving and all this kind of stuff. And Massachusetts and New England did have their local and state holidays from time to time. But there was no national holiday until 1863. And then basically every year since 1863, there has been a holiday on that last Thursday in November. It is true that the holiday also was replaced an existing national holiday that happened on November 25th, which most people don't know about. There was something called Evacuation Day. That was the day that the British left after the American Revolution, and it was celebrated during the early days of the Republic, and it was still celebrated a little bit, but was kind of fading out. And I think Lincoln kind of sensed that there was an opportunity for a national holiday to replace Evacuation Day. And so it wasn't that Evacuation Day became a Thanksgiving, but they were very similar in time on the calendar and that kind of stuff. It slowly became like the holiday it is today. It wasn't like a federal holiday at first. It was just something that Lincoln had called for in a proclamation. And then Grant signed a law where it was a holiday for Washington, D.C. employees. And then later on, I think in 1885, it became like kind of a federal holiday as it is kind of today. Now, of course, the actual celebration of Thanksgiving has for a long time, focused on the Pilgrims and this first Thanksgiving. And that was something that it wasn't necessarily always part of these early days of Thanksgiving, but it kind of came to be connected to them later. And it's still kind of fuzzy because, like in Massachusetts and New England, those remembrances were always kind of there, or for a long time were there. But at least in my opinion, the kind of connection to this earlier Pilgrim and Puritan history, I think is something that developed in the 19th century, probably a couple of hundred years after the actual first Thanksgiving, when American historians and others were looking back and trying to figure out where America came from and who were the founders of the country, earlier than the people who wrote the Constitution. And in my opinion, a very important moment was the publication of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, one of the most influential books ever written on America. And in this book, de Tocqueville talks about how amazing the Puritans were, how different they were from other colonists. Where most colonists came for wealth and riches, the Puritans came for ideas to establish their own kind of form of government. He talked about how they came in families, whereas most colonists were men, and families developed later. These were people who came with whole families right from the very beginning, always intent to stay. In other colonies, usually the early settlers were people who didn't intend to stay, but intended to get rich and go back home. So Alexis de Tocqueville made a big deal about the Puritans being special and different. And Americans, of course, thought they were special and different. And so it was natural for Americans to want to celebrate these ancestors who were very kind of different and stood out. So in my opinion, you put all those things together and you kind of get the modern celebration of Thanksgiving. So after the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris was signed, in which the British and the Americans agreed to the United States be independent and its own country, and they agreed on the borders and all that kind of stuff. Only after that peace treaty was signed did the British Army agree to leave New York. They had been in New York, occupying New York that entire time. The war had been actually over for a year and a half, because the fighting had largely been over. After the Battle of Yorktown, that's when the British decided to go ahead and have a peace treaty and okay, America's going to be independent. But that was 1781, and it took another 18 months for the peace treaty to be worked out of exactly what the boundaries were going to be and all that kind of stuff. So all that time, while there was not very much fighting going on anymore, the American army still had to stay together. The British army was still there, occupying New York. And it was a difficult period for the United States in some ways, because Washington's army had never been well funded. And after Yorktown, when the threat of military action was less, the states just stopped paying. And so a lot of the officers and soldiers weren't paid anymore, and Washington was having a tough time keeping his army together, and there's a lot of kind of mutinous threats by his soldiers against the civilian government. But Washington held it together during that period, and then sure enough, Franklin finished the treaty and got the treaty signed, and then it's only then that that the British left. So the last British soldier left New York City. That was on November 25th. That was Evacuation Day. And for a long time, the holiday included people all over the country, but in New York, there would be these greased pole contests where they would go up and there would be a Union Jack flag, and there would be there'd be races to see who could get up and bring the Union Jack flag down. And they would do that in other places as well. And it was kind of it was a significant celebration. Everything back in those days was not the way it is today, because communication was different. So a lot of things were more local. So the way Evacuation Day was celebrated in New York was probably different than it was in other places. But it was a national holiday, maybe not on the same level as July 4th, for example, or Washington's birthday, which would have been an even bigger holiday back then. But it was a national holiday, and I do think that some connection to that was in Lincoln's head whenever he decided on that day for Thanksgiving.